I'm Susan Stone. I'm the interim dean of the school, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our guests today. Professor Travis Salway, who is visiting us from Simon Fraser University, a extremely prolific social epidemiologist who has spent his career on issues, and I will tell you a little story about how I think he came to, but really focus on the health and well-being of sexual and gender minority populations writ large. Funny that you all should know this. When I first joined the faculty here as an assistant professor in 2001, Travis did an undergraduate honors thesis with me. There's so much continuity where he looked at interest factors shaping sexual education programs in the US, and really trying to think about the political influences on what would be considered a more or less well-rounded introduction to sexual health and well-being. So fast forward, I'd like to say it's my fault that Travis has become so successful.
It's true, it's true.
And really, I am so glad that you are here. This year, we've been inviting alumni and showcasing them, given the school's 80th and 100th anniversary, and I can't think of a better alumni representative.
Thanks, Susan.
And so I will turn it over to you to have your talk, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Oh, thanks. That's really kind. I'm going to see if I can manage a clicker and a mic at the same time. It's truly an honor to be invited back here. I really especially want to thank you, Susan. That's a really nice intro. And thank you to Jen and to Dora for all of your help arranging the visit. I speak publicly at my own university all the time, and I'm generally fine, but there is definitely something about coming back to your alma mater that really triggers the imposter syndrome. So if I seem a bit nervous, it's because like my undergraduate thesis mentor is here. And I do hope to do justice to the amazing education I received here in the late 90s and early aughts. And I also want to say that if the impending hostile takeover of Canada happens, which I hope it does not, I'd like to surrender here in Berkeley. So invite me back if that happens. Now, will this, it's sleeping. It's sleeping. There we go. Okay, so let's start. I want to invite all of us to take a moment to recognize the Huichin territory, the Ohlone people. When I was a student here, I did learn about the American Indian movement, including the occupation of Alcatraz in the 60s and 70s, but I did not learn about the deeper roots and histories of the Ohlone people and their ongoing presence on these lands. And I'm thrilled to see greater visibility of these tribes today, including this mural at the bottom of the slide, which represents a Bay Area movement of returning lands to the rightful stewards and owners here in the Bay Area. I currently live on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This is colonially known as Vancouver, Canada. The mural at the top of this slide is situated in the downtown east side of our city, which I'm sad to say is one of the most densely street entrenched neighborhoods you'll find anywhere in North America. It's also the site from which hundreds of Indigenous women have gone missing over the last couple of decades. This is an ongoing and avoidable injustice on both sides of the border. And I'm mentioning this because when I look at this mural of Indigenous women smudging, and I think about the struggle that Indigenous women have fought through resiliently, it's not unlike what I'm going to tell you about what's happened around organizing conversion therapy survivors in Canada and beyond. When we in Canada have watched these women deal with invisibility, doubt, gaslighting, about something so distressing to both individuals and communities, something violently colonial in both these cases, right? In murdered and missing Indigenous women and survivors of conversion therapy. It reminds me that there is a path toward justice, and survivors of injustice will lead the way. When I give land acknowledgements in talks about conversion therapy, I like to start with a brief two-spirit teaching. Is anyone familiar with this term? I never know when I go to a new place if people have worked with two-spirit before. Do you want to offer definition or interpretation? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah. What was your name? Michelle was just saying in the room, it's an indigenous understanding of gender that rejects the binary. Absolutely. So this is an umbrella term that's been with us for about 35 years now. It was coined in the late 80s, early 90s by indigenous leaders. And it's a reclamation, some would say a social identity or a movement of gender diverse roles that were embraced by many cultures indigenous to Turtle Island or North America long before contact with Europeans. Two-spirit teachings remind us that gender and sexual diversity are natural facets of human expression, and whether these things are celebrated or stigmatized are entirely functions of our cultures, our institutions, and our political language. So in my culture, I'm descended from European settlers, and I grew up in a pretty devoutly Catholic family. Being gay or trans was first a sin and then a marker of shame. But two-spirit leaders and indigenous elders have been teaching me and offered these teachings to all of us that there's a different way of seeing these traits if we follow the cultural teachings of those indigenous to these lands. And so on the left is another mural from Vancouver. This one is called Two-Spirit Rising. It's by Salish artist Margaret August. I've included Margaret's Insta handle here, encourage people to follow her, purchase their work. And then I was walking down through the mission the other day, and then I kind of like squealed because I stumbled upon this mural, again, reminding us that Two-Spirit and indigiqueer people have been here since time immemorial. This mural reminded me to tell you about BATES, which is the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits, an organization that I really encourage you to support if you're interested in getting more connected to Two-Spirit movement. Several of my students who are Two-Spirit have come to their annual Two-Spirit powwow and described it as one of the most impactful events of their lives. So really grateful that Bates is continuing to work out of the mission, I think. I've seen their office. I'm looking at David since he lives in the mission. Okay, so the work I'm about to present to you is the result of collective research and advocacy of dozens of people, and I've named a few here now. So on the left, this is a gathering we had with conversion therapy survivors in the fall of 2019. A lot of what I'm sharing is what I've learned from survivors of conversion therapy, and not only because of the survivor momentum, the survivor activism that brought about this federal ban, but because of the organizing they've done, we actually are able to reach way more survivors of conversion therapy, I think, than would have been possible before 2020. I'm also fortunate to have a phenomenal team of students and research staff in Vancouver. We're called the Reaffirm Collaborative, which stands for Researching Affirmation in Identities, Relationships, and Mental Health. And some of our students and staff are watching online, so shout out to you. And then my co-investigators from across Canada, and one of whom is here today. So David Kinnitz is here, and Dr. Kinnitz is now a postdoc at Stanford, soon to be assistant prof in social work at Ohio State University. So thanks for coming, David. And really, you'll see David's contributions woven throughout this talk. So I have two stories to share with you today. One is the story of how Canada criminalized conversion therapy and what we learned about contemporary conversion practices along the way. But the other is a story of how we built a flexible, community-responsive, multi-sector, interdisciplinary research network that will now evolve from understanding how to enforce the conversion therapy ban, that was our priority going back 3 years, to now understanding how we'll fight against state-sponsored transgender antagonism. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you that trans rights are under attack in an unprecedented fashion. We are not immune to this policy regression in Canada. I'm hopeful, I was talking to Dora beforehand, I'm hopeful that our judicial and democratic processes will help us withstand the political backlash. But that's to be determined, right? We still have a lot of work to do in Canada to see how this plays out. And I'll tell you more of that story toward the end of the talk. One of the greatest challenges to researching and then preventing conversion practices is arriving at a well-delineated definition. So let me attempt to give you my own. And you'll notice here that I tend not to use the more familiar term conversion therapy, simply because these practices are not therapeutic, quite the opposite, for the vast majority of those exposed. And in my definition, I draw heavily on our colleague Florence Ashley, who is a trans legal scholar at the University of Alberta and has written the defining book on model laws for banning conversion practices targeting transgender people. So the first term I want to draw your attention to is organized attempts. So not just talking about conversations or nudges that you might have with your family members or a religious leader, but more like classes or activities, workshops, coaching, counseling, that are all intended to deter the adoption or expression of non-heterosexual behaviors and or identities. Depending on the practice, it may focus a little bit more on how you express who you are, or it might focus more on how you behave, how you show up in the world, who you have sex with, et cetera. And or behaviors or identities that are associated with a gender other than that which was assigned at birth. Now, I note here that the Canadian law that went into effect 3 years ago goes a step further. So in Canadian criminal law, the language of organized attempts doesn't have a lot of meaning. It would be too imprecise for the members of parliament and the attorney general to adopt that kind of language. So they say, they still keep this language around deterring the adoption of these particular non-normative behaviors and identities, but the practice itself needs to be a practice, treatment, or service, which has particular meaning in the Canadian Criminal Code. I'm going to come back to this point later, but effectively no conversion practitioners today call what they're doing conversion therapy. So, if you go try to find a program advertised as conversion therapy, you're not going to find it. And what that means is if you're trying to come up with a set of terms that will describe these practices, it's really a Sisyphean task. You're just constantly adding terms, removing terms, clarifying terms. And so I'll just throw out a few, but this is not an exhaustive list. And by tomorrow, these terms might mean something different. So reparative therapy is often used, repairing whatever is thought to be the deficit in terms of your sexuality or gender. Change efforts, so often you'll see things described as sexual orientation or gender identity change efforts. Gender exploratory therapy, which is really a practice designed to get transgender children or youth to delay a social transition. Ex-gay ministries, ex-trans ministries, it goes on and on and on. This is a shifting target, and this is one of the biggest challenges for both researchers and those of us interested in preventing exposure to conversion practices. I'll tend to use conversion practices, or SOGIs, which stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression change efforts, which is a mouthful, but hopefully gets at the sense that this is more than just a very small set of circumscribed practices. The most important definitional thing from my perspective, which I tried to express as often as I could during the debates over the Canadian legislation, is that this is not about conversion. If you focus on conversion, any focus on conversion is going to lead us to a very, very limited understanding of what these practices actually do. Rather, the fundamental purpose of these practices is to systematically cast doubt upon the legitimacy of queer and trans lives. In this sense, even though you're going to hear a lot of cynicism from me about where we landed with this law, I am, at the end of the day, really proud that the passage of the law sent an unequivocal message to queer and trans people in Canada that there's nothing inherently wrong with our genders or sexualities. And that's something that even the addition of, so in past years, we saw policy advances where the Liberals were able to add sexual orientation and then gender identity and expression to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a huge accomplishment, right? But even those policy amendments could not do what this law did, right? Those are about protecting rights to equality, which are important. We need to have those protections in place for equity-deserving populations. But this is about the legitimacy of being. It has a different power and a different message to people in Canada. And so even if that's all we got from this process, I'm quite proud of that. Okay, following that lengthy preamble, let me outline the remainder of this talk, which is in 4 parts. First, the ban, I call it the ban we did not ask for, and then the ban we needed. Third, the ban we got, and then fourth, I'll briefly talk about what we need to do now to transition into a new era of political threats, particularly as they pertain to transgender people. Okay, this is the fun part. So when Jen contacted me about giving this talk, I was first very flattered, very excited, and then I was inspired to dig up some old photos from my time at Cal. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. But first we have my dorm room, upper left. This was at Unit 1 back in 1998, which you can tell from the Windows 98 on my laptop. So I don't know if you can see this, but my room was plastered with pictures of my high school girlfriend. Do you remember this one? So this was clearly meant to assert my heterosexuality to my floor mates. I hope that worked okay. This would be a good time to disclose that although I have not myself directly experienced conversion practices, this was absolutely one possible pathway for me. So my family includes a number of devout Catholics. Had I come out to them before college, I'm quite certain that they would have suggested one of these programs, right? And for context, further context, I should say I grew up in the Midwest. So there's also, I think that's part of maybe the geographic patterning happening here. Below this is a photo from a Take Back the Night rally in probably 2001. When I tell people, and a shout out to my friend Lillian Tsai, who was at Cal with me. Were you at this march? So when I tell people I went to Berkeley, they get really excited, right? Because they have this romanticized version of Berkeley, and they're like, "Well, this is a politically radical environment," and I have to say, no, not really. But it nonetheless facilitated a kind of political awakening for me, and I think the activities that I did at Cal were probably as important to me as what I learned in the classroom. And okay, here's the thesis that Susan mentioned. I reread it the other day. I cringed at my writing far less than I was expecting. So, but really grateful, Susan, for your mentorship. And then last, this was my first job post-grad. I was a community health specialist in the HIV program at Asian Health Services downtown Oakland. And this moment in 2002 really solidifies for me the connection between my time here at the School of Social Welfare and my current research 23 years later. And I think you're right, Susan, that there was something going on for me, trying to connect the dots around institutions, political interests, and queer and trans lives that has crystallized over the years. And so I just want to share with you, and I promise that Jen or Susan did not ask me to say this, just some meta skills that I think have served me well that I really attribute to my time here at the School of Social Welfare. One is what I talk to my students about is as critical appraisal of institutions. So we know that institutions will tend to regress and resist threats to normalcy over time. And as social workers and as scholars, we have to continue to shine lights on the points of resistance. And that's what I really think we were doing with the conversion therapy research. Like a lot of our conversations were with folks in medicine who were like, there's no way this could still be happening in the Canadian medical system. And we're like, yes. Here are a few examples you might want to look at. Discipline blurring. My favorite thing about being a social welfare alum and an epidemiologist is I get to remind epidemiologists that they do not, in fact, understand people and environments. And I get to ask them what variables are missing. And how do we bring these different disciplines merging together or clashing together? And I think the more we do that, the more effective our scholarship is. And then finally, I learned about the deep value of action research. And that's what my supervisor, Philip Huang, who's just to the left of me in this photo on the bottom right, that's something that he really supported and taught me and enabled at Asian Health Services. Every time we did research or evaluation embedded within our program, it was with an immediate eye to how is this going to improve HIV programming for gay men in the East Bay. We'll talk about this later when we get to some of the publication outputs from the conversion therapy research, but we didn't have time to wait for embargo for any of these research results, right? The policy window was real short. So we brought the research to the legislators and the community leaders as soon as it was analyzed. And so that's something I took from here, I think, is really research. I think we all aspire not to be ivory tower researchers and academics, but really digging deeper around where's the action that needs to happen. Okay, so now let's fast forward about 15 years from California to Canada. And in the year 2019, something fairly surprising happened, which is that the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Health, so one of our federal standing committees, commissioned the first ever federal study of Two-Spirit and LGBTQ health. And at this point, I should explain that the Liberal Party, which is our centrist party in Canada, although I would say their policy agenda approximates that of Democrats in the US, and they're I love this picture of Justin Trudeau. They're very proud of their history around LGBTQ rights, and they remind us of it all the time. And if you see a picture of Justin Trudeau, you have a 1 in 2 chance he's in a pride parade. He loves pride parades. So now they They do have things to be proud of, right? So Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, famously said in 1967, so this is 2 years before Canada decriminalized homosexuality, he said there's no place for the state in the bedroom of the nation. And that is something that Liberals are quite proud of, that they took a firm stance on how homosexuality is not a crime at a time when that was not necessarily a popular belief. In 2005, so just before the Harper government, the Liberals were the driving force behind the passage of equal marriage protection in Canada. So, the track record is there. I am a nerd, and so I like to fact check politicians. And so our team took an index that was developed in Europe by an organization called ILGA Europe. It indexes about 60 plus policies that governments throughout Europe have adopted to affirm the lives of queer and trans people. And it's a score from 0 to 100 once you scale across all the policies. And what we see here from 1977 to 2023 is that there's quite steady progress. I should point out that I don't have it here, but the graph for the US doesn't look quite as even. But even within this relatively steady climb, we do have a period right in here between 2005 to 2015. That was the last conservative government in Canada where you can see things plateau for sure. So they're not wrong. And by the way, when we rank Canada across the other countries in Europe that have been ranked, Canada comes second, which was kind of surprising to me, even ahead of Belgium and Denmark. And second only to Malta, which for reasons I don't yet understand, have a very active LGBTQ political organization going on. So this looks promising, so I'm inclined to believe our Prime Minister, except for this. The health profile of queer Canadians is really quite disparate from that of cisgender, heterosexual, or cishet Canadians. So here we have the prevalence of mood disorders by year comparing lesbian, gay, bisexual, and heterosexual people in Canada between 2003 and 2020, I think is the last year here. I want to note here that we do not have trans-inclusive federal survey data in Canada going back more than 5 years. So for the long view here, we're looking at sexual orientation disparities. And what I want you to notice here is not only has the disparity in mental health between these groups persisted, it's actually widened. And so find that we are seeing incremental improvements in the legal and political rights afforded to queer and trans people in Canada, but that is not corresponding to a reduction in inequities in health. And we call this the policy paradox. If the point of these policies is to actually bring LGBTQ people into a place where they have equal opportunities for health and economic achievement, et cetera, we're not there yet. Shameless plug, we have a survey going on our website, which is called Rainbow Canada, which basically the point of Rainbow Canada is for us to get a better policy index for Canada. The survey is very short. It's basically just asking you, hey, what are we missing? And there's a few things we already know we're missing in this index, one of which I'll come back to at the end, which is school-based policies. So we're in a new era, as I think you are in the US, where we're now seeing a crackdown on how trans youth are being affirmed within schools. So this needs to now be added to the index to account for what's happening. So Bill Casey, he was a former Liberal member of Parliament and the chair of the Standing Committee on Health, commissioned this study. I was one of 33 witnesses called, and really the premise was that policy paradox. So Bill Casey and the Standing Committee on Health are like, how could we have done all this work over 50 years, all these policy advances, we've committed all this money federally and provincially to queer and trans health, we've provided supports to address HIV, mental health, et cetera, and we still see these huge gaps in the health status. And when I talked to the librarians behind the Standing Committee on Health, like, well, what do you want me to talk about? They wanted me to talk about my PhD research, which was about the epidemiology of queer suicide in Canada. And I said to them, I'm really here for like the actionable recommendations, and I don't know what to tell you to do about that disparity in suicide. And I was really kind of stressed on the flight to Ottawa, but right before I got on the plane, I saw a news headline from CBC, and it basically said there was a member of parliament from the NDP, that's our socialist party, our left-leaning party, Sherry Benson from Saskatchewan, had presented to the federal government a petition calling for a federal ban on conversion therapy. And David Lametti, who was our Attorney General at the time, rejected that plea. You can see in the kind of the subheading here. He said, yeah, okay, these practices are immoral, but this is a matter for the provinces and territories. And what he means is in Canadian policy, the federal government is not responsible for healthcare. That falls upon the provinces. Each province decides how they're going to allocate healthcare dollars and how they're going to regulate that. And so he said, conversion therapy, this is about health, mental health, and pseudoscientific use of those resources. And I didn't really like this response because just by accident, no lie, I was sitting on survey data that talked about for gay men in Canada who had gone to conversion therapy, like what was it like? Where did they go? And sure enough, there were a good number of people going to conversion therapy outside the healthcare system. So when I appeared, I was like so nervous. I was a little baby, even though it was 5 years ago. I was like so baby. And that's our colleague Alex Abramovich. On my left, he does research in the overrepresentation of trans youth in the homeless population in Toronto. Tristan Kuhlman, who's involved in PFLAG out in Ontario. So we all made different recommendations for what we thought that the standing committee should do. So I'll tell you about those recommendations, but first let me just explain what I mean by the ban. We did not ask for it. And when I say this, I do not mean we hadn't asked for a ban. In this photo here is Matt Ashcroft. He's one of the most outspoken conversion therapy survivors in Canada. And Matt, among others, had been advocating for a federal ban for years before this. What I mean is that the draft legislation that the Liberals put forward, in particular using the mechanism of the criminal code, were not what most queer and trans conversion therapy survivors would have wanted. And so we're stuck in between what community and those with lived experience are telling us, what the research is telling us, and what the politicians want. These are two of the members of the Standing Committee on Health at the time. Ron McKinnon is a Liberal from out west, where I live. Robert Falcon-Ouellette is a Liberal from an Indigenous man, a Liberal politician from Winnipeg. And they both asked some really good questions back when I said, hey, I think you should reconsider MP Benson's petition here. I think actually there is a role for the federal government. And they said, okay, well, what are you talking about? Who is performing conversion therapy? They also asked, I don't have this here, like how many people are you talking about? Like, is it 2 or like 200, or who gets compelled to attend? How are they compelled? Matt's story was really, this is a really good example for me as an epidemiologist of where anecdote can fail. So Matt's story was really powerful in getting people to take action, but Matt had gone to the United States. As an adult, he was in his early 20s, he had gone to the United States to go to a program called Journey into Manhood. Let me tell you, the more you look at the titles of these programs, the more you're like, I think I could actually probably get better at detecting conversion practices or something close to it. But also, like, you start to wonder, like, the journey into manhood, is that the journey we need to be taking? So, so this was a good question, like, are we just banning it within our borders, or do we actually want to ban people getting sent to the States, which is what the politicians ended up doing in the case of minors? Here's the timeline that we're dealing with, and basically, this was the study in 2019 that the Standing Committee on Health did. In March of 2020, the legislation was introduced. In fact, it was introduced on the Monday of the week when the WHO declared the pandemic. So we had a real short runway and a brief start to this. When the stars represent times when our parliament was either suspended or prorogued. So the first time is because of COVID, that first star, and the second star is because our prime minister thought that maybe he'd take a stab at getting a majority government. He did not. And it meant that the bill that was currently had been tabled, whenever they call an election, all the bills are wiped clean and we have to start over again. So we actually had three attempts at this bill, which for me as a researcher, this was actually kind of a good thing. It gave us a lot of time for data collection, right? If it had gone straight through in 2020 and there had never been a pandemic, we wouldn't have had the particular data that we had to bring to bear on this. In December of 2021, this picture is from the day that the bill passed, and it passed with all party support because of a very rare mechanism used by the Conservatives to actually foreclose any further debate on the bill and just bring it to a vote. They had whipped all their votes and they got all the Conservatives to vote for it. The cynic in me is like, whoa, what happened there? But I would be lying to you if I told you I did not cry on that day watching. It's a very rare moment to see the opposition party crossing the aisle to shake hands with the prime minister. So that's Justin Trudeau. And then he's shaking hands with Erin O'Toole, who is a fairly moderate conservative leader. And he'll come back into the story in a moment. So I'm really streamlining this, but what I want you to understand here is that it was a rocky road. And although I want to tell you that our responses, the research, this became our research agenda for 5 years, right? When I went back to my collaborators, I was like, are these good questions? Or, what do we think? And, one response could be like, well, yes, of course it's happening. And of course it's happening outside the healthcare system. And of course people are getting compelled. But that wasn't satisfying to us. We wanted to actually dig into to these answers through empirical research, particularly because there was a narrative that this is a US problem. And we wanted to understand actually to what degree is it a Canadian problem? I hope that what the research we generated played an instrumental role in the legislation we got. But if on a bad day, I think there's a lot of political twists and turns. And I think about this more and more in 2025, now that I look over the last 2 years where we've started to see the introduction of anti-trans policies in some provinces. And we've heard our conservative leader, who currently polls to be the next prime minister, confirming his stance that these measures are in step with his political priorities. So why was there suddenly all-party support? Like, what happened that the Conservatives should have so suddenly come on side? And some political analysts, here's an article by Josh Isley in the Canadian journal Policy Alternatives. And let me just read this quote to you. Shortly after the legislation passed in the House of Commons in June, so this is June 2021, so this would have been after third reading. So the bill had already gone to committee for study. We'd made revisions. It went back to the full floor of the House, and it was now for open debate in the House of Commons. And our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau at the time, really embraced this narrative that Conservatives did not want to support the LGBTQ community. What happened is the Conservatives had started to say, we like gay people too, and we get behind gay rights as well. And the Liberals wanted to kind of say, well, like, what's the phrase? Put your money where your mouth is. Like, let's actually see how committed you are to this. And Trudeau started to argue the Conservatives don't want to support the LGBTQ community, LGBTQ children, or the ban. And during the leaders' debate in September, this is when the election had been called, the Prime Minister accused the Conservative leader of being unable to get his caucus to pass the bill. And the Liberals used campaign communications to claim that more than half of the Conservative caucus was against banning conversion therapy, which is nearly true, close to that. So when the bill actually passed, we were watching really carefully to see how the Conservative politicians reacted. And there were some more moderate politicians like Erin O'Toole, who was the leader at the time, or Kevin Waugh, who's a Conservative politician from out in Saskatchewan, who called this a pretty good day, a very good day, sorry, very good day, don't let me not get those words wrong. It was meaningful to see all-party support. But at the same time, we saw the emergence of a far-right party in Canada called the People's Party of Canada, they're for the people. And this is what it says on their website still today. Bill C4, which was unanimously adopted by all parties in the House of Commons in 2021, criminalizes parents and their therapists who try to help minors with gender dysphoria, accept who they are. In effect, the law bans conversion therapy in one direction, it's talking about with regard to targeting sexual orientation, but allows it in the other. It is illegal to treat children for a mental disorder, but it is legal to encourage them to undergo gender-affirming therapy and mutilate their body. So they've taken a pretty hard stance on the degree to which they are supportive of gender-affirming social or medical transitions in Canada. And to make sense of this, and now this is getting into a bit of political conjecture, and I'm not a political economist, so take all of this with a grain of salt. This is 338 Canada. This is our version of Nate Silver's website where they aggregate all the different polls. Here we have 2022 on the left, which is exactly when the law went into effect in January. Right after the law went into effect, Erin O'Toole resigned. And then this line over here is when the new leader, the current leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, who endorses more of a social conservative agenda, went into power. And what I want to draw your attention to is the polling for the People's Party of Canada. As soon as Erin O'Toole leaves, and certainly after Pierre Poilievre takes over the Conservative Party, support for the People's Party of Canada declined. And one explanation for this is that the Conservatives decided to bring back into the fold the social conservative wing. They decided to say, we are going to accommodate your demands around what we're doing for queer and trans people. And I think that's important because it reminds me that the political moment now is very different from 2021. And while I'm proud of this history of what we've done legislatively, we have to be really careful about where this is going. And the future of this bill is pretty uncertain, of the law is pretty uncertain. Pierre Poilievre has said he will consider overturning the conversion therapy ban if he comes to power. So conservatives were forced from when Justin Trudeau called them out, how serious are you about this, to Erin O'Toole stepping down, to getting a new leader to their party. They were forced to clarify their position with regard to LGBTQ issues, and I'm afraid the line was drawn at the expense of trans people. And I say this because as recently as last summer, Pierre Poilievre went on record saying he has no interest in overturning marriage equality. He's like, that's a done deal. We're not revisiting that. But they've been quite vocal about what should be done with regard to trans youth. So that's where our attention is shifting. And when we get to the end of the talk, I'll tell you what that kind of looks like. So let's bracket this political silliness and look at what we were able to uncover during our research these last 5 years. So research in this section corresponds to two larger strands of research. One is a global systematic review that took us quite a lot of time, but I'm happy to say it's now finished. And we addressed two research questions in that review. What's the prevalence of conversion practices globally? And what's the nature of conversion practices globally? In other words, who does it? What does it look like? When do people get exposed, et cetera? I meant to tell you that I have a QR code at the end that will take you to a website with links to all of the references in this talk, so you don't need to write anything down. This is a snapshot of our literature search strategy. And what I want you to take away here is the diversity of keyword terms that are needed. So we looked at terms related to conversion, repair, reorientation, and change efforts, and then this other category, which we worked with our librarian at UBC, Dean Giustini, to kind of improve the sensitivity and specificity of these terms over and over and over again. And this was, again, back to that problem around definitions, a really difficult task. I'm going to come back to this later in the talk to point out how this created even more challenges for the research process. So in total, we reviewed 1,000 abstracts, 100 full texts, and we found 69 articles that addressed one or both of these research questions. Now, in parallel, I'm going to share with you some results from our Canadian research. And one curious but frustrating thing that happens in Canada, and maybe it happens here too, is you'll show decent research evidence from around the world that something is a problem. You'll go to a policymaker and say, like, let's take action on this. And they'll say, yeah, but that doesn't happen here. This is British Columbia. This is Canada. We're somehow special. We're somehow immune to this. And so then you have to go and get local evidence to show, like, no, we're not so different. That border is pretty porous, as President Trump will remind us. So local evidence becomes very important, and we mobilize this through existing surveys like Sex Now, which is a periodic survey of gay and bisexual men in Canada, recruits about 8,000 to 10,000 people per cycle. Median age there is 34. I'm pointing this out because you'll see some differences in the results between samples that is largely attributable to the age profile of these samples. So this is a general adult sample of cis and trans men. David and I worked David particularly worked on 22 in-depth interviews. So after Parliament got closed, and the pandemic happened, all of our interviews moved on to Zoom, which was good from the perspective that we were able to reach survivors from across Canada, but challenging for the reason that people are alone in their homes, having very difficult conversations about traumatic topics. We also did a survey of 70 survivors. That's to get a broader picture of kind of where they thought we were at with the bill. We wanted immediate feedback on how we could improve the bill. The median age there is 33, so quite similar to the Sex Now surveys. And then in 2022, right after the bill went into law, we did a survey of 10,000 15 to 29-year-old mostly trans and non-binary, but also some cis queer youth in US and Canada. Median age there is 17. So quite a younger sample. So when you see results from Unicorn, keep that in mind. I just want to point out, these are the publication outputs from this suite of studies. And none of them were published before this went to committee. So I was saying to someone earlier, we can't, embargo and don't share the results until it's gone through peer review just doesn't work. for this kind of research, right? Like the policy window was real short. We couldn't, especially during COVID, it was taking like 12 months to get papers through. Like we couldn't wait that long. Now, of course, peer review is still important, right? And when we present the results, we need to be honest that they have not yet undergone peer review. But I think, it has me, again, thinking back to what I was saying earlier about action research and who gets the data when they need it. So these are our cross-cutting research questions that apply to both the global systematic review and our local Canadian studies. How many people are affected? Who's perpetrating conversion practices and in what settings? What modalities are being used? At what age are people first exposed? That's important because there was a big debate in the Canadian law. Initially, it was only focused on people under 18 and minors. And we made the argument that even adults who go to this with consent are going under particular circumstances that makes their consent actually not freely given and freely informed. And for how long are they exposed? And I won't talk at all about the safety or effectiveness of conversion practices because that's covered quite extensively in other books and papers. So here was the first output from this review. And this forest plot is showing you prevalence with wide variability across different geographies. But there were enough studies in Canada and the US for us to answer that question that the politicians had asked us, which is like, is this in fact a US phenomenon or do we have it in Canada? And there was some truth to that doubt because you can see here the burden of conversion practices in the US is quite a bit higher, right? About double that what we see in Canada. So definitely some truth there, but even 7%, that's too many, right? So using conservative population size estimates, we have about 1.5 million sexual and gender minorities in Canada. So if 7% of them are exposed, that's 100,000 people who are living with this trauma, who require particular supports in their recovery, right? Particularly the ones who are in these programs for a long time. They need to be working in a healing space that understands the unique context of these practices. So the other important finding from this review that we think is novel is that we also saw variation in conversion practice prevalence by gender identity and modality. So the top two estimates, these median estimates that you're seeing, are among cisgender participants in these global surveys. And you can see that the prevalence among cisgender people assigned male at birth was 8%, and the prevalence among those who are cis assigned female at birth was 3%. So that's quite a big difference between cis boys and cis girls. And similarly, now the prevalence estimates were higher for trans and non-binary respondents than for cisgender respondents. So that is, of course, important. But within that, the same kind of effect modification or moderation where the prevalence estimates were higher for those assigned male at birth. Now, you might think, and a lot of people have said to us, well, is this because those who are socialized as girls, as women, actually experience a different type of conversion practice that they may not label as conversion practices? Absolutely, that is probably going on, and we have some work to do to sort that out. Whether this is an artifact of how we're actually defining and measuring conversion practices or a real phenomenon, we still have work to do to understand what's going on here. Either some people are not understanding what they went through with conversion practices, or there is a real difference and there's a gendered phenomenon here. So who's perpetrating conversion practices in what setting? This is important if we think about the mechanism of policy or legislation you want to use. If it's entirely happening in the healthcare system, as David Lametti initially asserted, then this is a matter for medical regulators, right, and healthcare regulators to take care of. But if it's happening outside the healthcare system, maybe there's a role for the criminal code, or if not the criminal code, some other consumer rights avenues, or possibly human rights avenues. So there was 30-some studies we reviewed from the systematic review. On the right, this is giving you a crude sense of in how many of the studies did this modality show up. And I'm just going to point out a few things here. There's a lot, and if you look at the paper, this is a very, very long table that goes into a lot of detail about the modalities. But just a snapshot here, I think gender role enforcement, oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Mental health practitioners, yeah, so mental health practitioners, yes, we knew this, but I think one of the takeaways from the review is that a lot of this happens through referral networks, right? So it's not just like you go out and search for a mental health provider who can help you deal with questions around sexuality or gender identity. It's typically through, especially in a religious context like the Mormon Church, you're looking for counselors that you know will approach therapy from a Mormon perspective, right? That's how they kind of keep these practices in place and how people find their way to them. Religious retreats, I just want to point out that the vast majority of research that we've found, and I think this is also true in the interviews in Canada, are from people who are in Christian contexts. I mean, Christians have really done the most work developing these practices as far as I can tell, but we did interview people in Canada who were Muslim, and we did find a couple of papers in the systematic review, particularly from Muslim trans and queer people who were sent to programs where they were really reminded of the religious values at play there. When it comes to faith leaders, I think one of the important takeaways is that, again, it really takes a village for these things to go into place. So it's not just that you have a religious leader, pastor, priest who is guiding the way. That person is working with a therapist who is kind of backing up what they're saying, and group work becomes really important, right? And I'll talk about this on the next slide, but group work, just like in 12-step programs, that like norming around a group of peers becomes really important in the effectiveness of the programs. And lastly, Sarah Golightly is a researcher in social welfare in the UK, in Edinburgh. And Sarah's PhD research was all about the troubled teen industry or therapeutic boarding schools. I think Paris Hilton went to one. And Sarah herself went to a troubled teen industry school and has done extensive interviews with people who've survived those programs, which are often unregulated and can be quite traumatic in the practices used. And she found multiple examples of conversion therapy that was embedded within therapeutic boarding schools. And so now that's a minority, that only showed up in one paper. But we think it's important to pay attention to where these practices may show up across different sectors. Looking at the Canadian data, so these are 3 different surveys, the Sex Now and Unicorn survey that I told you about, and then our colleague Martin Blais survey, Uni LGBTQ, which is a Quebec-specific survey, reminds us that for the most part in Canada, we're still seeing this primarily in religious contexts, although don't ignore that 20 to 30% who have experienced this in licensed healthcare practitioner settings. But this reminds me that it's all very context dependent. So why is the percentage in religious settings so much lower in Quebec? This is likely attributable to the fact that Quebec is a far less religious society than other provinces in Canada. So you're less likely to encounter these practices in a religious context as compared to healthcare context. In the paper, you'll see a very long list. I think we identified Stephanie Black, one of our team members, and I thematically coded all of the different modalities that came out of this systematic review. And then we grouped them iteratively into what turned out to be 10 different modalities, which is 6 or 7 more than what the UN commissioner who did a review on this found. So I think there's actually a lot more variability here than we expected. And I've just highlighted 3 of them for you here. I think gender role enforcement is so prevalent. This is, telling people what sports they should play, how to dress, how to do their hair. And this is really helps us understand the connection between conversion practices targeting sexual orientation and those targeting gender identity expression. There's a lot of overlap. And if you think of someone who's quite young, who hasn't yet adopted or expressed their identity as trans or queer or whatever, the parents are often encouraging them to go to these programs without knowing exactly what it is that's non-normative, right? It's the stuff that's showing up early on is around gender roles. Group-based practices showed up in over half of the studies we looked at. And again, group-based practices really have an important within-group norming effect, where the members of the group help each other kind of stay on target with what the programs are trying to achieve, particularly around not engaging in same-sex sexual activity. And from every psychological modality you can think of shows up here, but the one that really caught my eye is aversion therapy, which has been quite prevalent and really makes sense if you think of queerness as an undesirable trait that should be avoided, which is the ideology of a lot of these programs. So the big challenge here is what meets that threshold? How do we define what is and isn't conversion practices? And how we've thought about this in the Canadian research space is a soft division between conversion therapy, which are more organized attempts to make people identify in a certain way or act a certain way. And then we've talked about a broader set of these change efforts, or SOGIs, which in the Unicorn survey we defined as, has any person in a position of authority, parent, caregiver, counselor, healthcare provider, religious leader, ever tried to deny, suppress, change, or lead you to doubt your gender identity, expression, or sexuality? So I would have to answer no to that first question. I didn't actually go to a formalized program, but for sure, many times in my life has someone doubted my identity. And so we think of this as like a pyramid, right? Like the conversion practices are upheld by this wider practice of SOGIs, which in turn is held up by systems of cissexism and heterosexism. Now, drawing this line in between the two is quite challenging. And so researching in this space means you have to be comfortable with kind of a shifting boundary. In terms of age, in the systematic review, we found just over half were first exposed before they were 18, but that still leaves quite a number of people who initiate conversion practices later in life, and the mean age of initiating conversion practices is 24 years. And for how long are they exposed? Most people are in the program for a brief amount of time. This is a plot from the Canadian survey we did with survivors, and you can see it has a long right tail. So that's important because there's a minority of people who experience this for 5 years, 10 years, even multiple decades. But the fact that they're in those programs for so long means that some of their needs when it comes to recovery and healing are even more pronounced. Can I ask for a time check? It's 1:05. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 10 minutes so we have time to chat. So let's talk about the ban we actually got. The first iteration of this ban, this would be pre-COVID, back in March of 2020, was pretty limited. So for instance, they define conversion practices as practices that would change a person's gender identity to cisgender. That just did not make sense. That was an example of people who had not spent any time talking to trans people about their interactions with these practitioners. No practitioner would ever say they're trying to change someone's gender identity to cisgender. So right off the bat, we worked with trans leaders and activists. Erica Muse, one of the most outspoken conversion therapy survivor activists, Faye Johnstone, who is pretty much leading the charge against the anti-trans movement in Canada, and Florence Ashley, who I mentioned earlier, a legal scholar and the first openly trans clerk of the Supreme Court of Canada. We wrote an open letter really outlining for Minister Lametti how you really missed the mark here. And if you're serious about including trans conversion practices, you need to get the language right. And so in the future iteration of the bill, when Parliament resumed, we convinced them to add not just change gender identity to cis, but change a person's gender expression so that it conforms to the sex assigned at birth, or reduce a person's gender expression that does not conform to the gender assigned at birth. So is the ban effective? And this is an important question, but one that we're just really not yet able to fully answer. These are some of the barriers that my colleague Bennett Jensen, who's a legal director at EGAL, has pointed out. So before someone even reports, I should say there's been to our knowledge, there's been no cases brought forward for prosecution in the last 3 years since the bill became law. We understand that the pre-reporting stage, a lot of people, again, around that mismatch of definition, will not be able to identify conversion practices when they experience it. At the reporting stage, we know particularly for trans and queer people, there's a lot of distrust of law enforcement. So the first step is you have to go to the police and get them to take this seriously. And then there's limited aptitude on the part of law enforcement to understand these practices. And then at the enforcement stage, which we know very well from survivors of intimate partner violence and gender-based violence, it's a really high bar to establish criminal conduct. The evidentiary requirements are quite overwhelming. They largely fall upon the survivor who has to tell and retell their story of trauma. And you're not anonymous, right? So this is not a terribly appealing mechanism for most survivors. Now we might ask, well, apart from whether people avail themselves of this law, is it deterring conversion practices? And I would have to answer again, I don't think so, because there's so much mislabeling of practices. And very often they're misaligning their description of the practice with the definition that's in the law. If the ban were to help defer conversion practices, a mediating step along the way is that people have to know that they're illegal. And so in Unicorn Study, this is the best we're going to get, folks, because this was like 2 months after the law went into effect, and we were in the New York Times. We're so excited. Like, New York Times paid attention to us. That was the most people ever would have heard about conversion therapy in Canada, right, David? And half of the queer and trans youth in Canada didn't even know it was illegal. So I don't know how. I'm happy that half of them knew, but we have a lot of work to do if folks are not getting this message. My colleague, Kirsty Clark, who's a psychologist and epidemiologist at Vanderbilt, has worked with me on actually spelling out, well, okay, maybe there's not a direct effect, and anyway, if there were, that would be specific to the 9 or 10% of sexual and gender minorities exposed. Might there be an indirect effect, a normative effect, back to what I was saying about, all party support saying that these practices are immoral, and therefore now maybe there's less stigma for queer and trans people. I'm hopeful, I'm hopeful, but I'll wait to see the evidence on that one. This is one last data point I'll share from Unicorn that I find really fascinating. So we asked, well, what would you say if a friend said they were going to conversion therapy? And a small number of people said they would encourage them. 79% said they'd stop them. Great. This is what I'm really interested in. The 18% who were like, I don't know. Or maybe something else. The excerpt on the bottom right really tugs at my heart. They said, if the friend deems it necessary as part of their religion, I would just say there's always room for them in my home. Which reminds me, prerequisite to any of this stuff working, including legal justice, is having stable housing and having some supportive friends. So I think there's a huge opportunity here in how we build off of the ban to help support trans and queer youth. One hot take that I could be totally wrong about, could the ban actually reduce the severity of the conversion practices that are offered? So here's a quote from a CBC reporter. This was in 2018, so before the federal ban, but after the city of Vancouver passed a municipal ban. And they looked at a program called Journey Canada that's based in Vancouver, goes across Canada. And what it said on their website at the time, as a discipleship ministry, we do not seek to change the sexual orientation of the people who participate in our programs. But then further on, it continues to state, a majority of participants experience a reduction in the strength or power of same-sex attraction, orientation, an increased hope, strength, desire, and ability to live in accordance with their personal beliefs regarding sexual ethics. Some people would say this smells a bit like some of the components of conversion practices, but they've drawn a line. This is the part that caught my attention. The caveat that such changes are neither the program's primary aim nor a litmus test for its success. I still wouldn't recommend folks go to this program, but if it means that they're a little bit less strict about, do you have to tell them that you've reduced your same-sex attraction in order to make it through the program, I'll take whatever small successes we can get. Harm reduction approach, right? Speaking of harm reduction, my colleague Jordan Sullivan, who is a conversion therapy survivor and trans rights activist and mental health worker at the Community-Based Research Center, has done incredible work over the last few years creating a set of resources in Canada on the website stopconversionpractices.ca. If you click through the link at the end, you'll see I've given you the US counterpart, which is called Born Perfect, a program of the National Center of Lesbian Rights. These are some of the survivors that I have worked with and I'm very appreciative to. Lucas on the bottom left here has just published an edited collection of conversion therapy stories from US and Canada. It's really quite a beautiful collection that I encourage you to check out. And so now a coda on this whole story. So in 2021, David and I were sued by a practitioner here in California, a psychologist. And this brings us back to this set of terms that we needed to include in our keyword search. You have to try to strike a balance here, right? We can't list everything, but we do have to look at the things that people are saying are conversion practices or are close to or tantamount or might be conversion practices. That does, however, open up risk of litigation. So that case was dismissed in the Federal District Court 2 years ago, but we've appealed it. And the reason we've appealed it is because in California, you have a statute called the anti-SLAPP law, which SLAPP stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation, and it simply seeks to limit the degree to which people can threaten lawsuits of defamation to chill free speech. And so I'm mentioning this here because I wonder if this tactic will increase in this era of anti-LGBTQ polarized scholarship and advocacy. And I want us to be prepared and think about how we're supporting people who may not be as well protected as David and I were. Okay, last few thoughts. So, I am sad to say the political context has shifted since the conversion therapy law. Last fall, when we met as a coalition to abolish conversion practices, we pretty much unanimously agreed that fighting the rising anti-trans political tide is an acute priority. Celeste Trianon is a trans rights lawyer out in Quebec, and she has been updating this website that kind of gives you a sense of where we're at in each of the provinces. The danger spots right now are really Alberta and Saskatchewan, where legislation is moving, although Quebec has me worried as well. My colleague, Bennett Jensen, has been leading the charge going after these laws in court, challenging the degree to which they are violating the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The policy is basically boils down to a matter of you only respect the pronouns and names of trans teenagers if the parents give consent, which opens up two lines of risk for these teenagers. One is if the parents don't know that they're trans and they're opposed to their being trans, there's risk in the home. They might be kicked out of the home. And if the parents say no, now you're creating an environment in the classroom where you're systematically misgendering students, right? Which is exactly what conversion therapy seeks to do. So when we asked Bennett, well, what do we need to continue to fight these court cases? He said, actually more data are better. We know we can predict how these policies are going to affect trans youth, but the more we can show it in legal briefs and affidavits that go back to the judges, the better. So with my brilliant colleagues, Hannah Kia and Avery Everhart in social work and geography at UBC, we've just funded a prospective cohort of a few thousand trans teenagers that we'll be following over the next few years in Canada to generate evidence using the same kind of mechanisms that we established during the conversion therapy ban. That's my friend and conversion therapy survivor, Erica Muse, back in 2019. I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen and to do what you can to support trans rights and trans equity in your own communities. I'm happy to take any questions.